Trudging through the swampy muck, Brandon pressed forward, each step a labor in itself. The air around him was thick with noise, the soft patter of raindrops striking still water mingled with the relentless chirping of insects and the calls of unseen birds. Together, they created a wall of sound so loud it almost drowned out the sloshing of his boots as he forced his way ahead. His hip waders, worn and patched in places, had already started to fill with cold water, weighing him down even more. But despite the discomfort, Brandon kept moving, navigating through the twisted maze of mangrove trees that seemed to sprout directly from the dark, brackish water. The branches above formed a canopy, draped with Spanish moss that hung like strands of brittle, gray hair. Every now and then, he ducked to avoid brushing against the clumps of moss, his face grim with focus. This place wasn't forgiving, not in the slightest. The roots of the mangroves jutted up from the water like broken bones, ready to trip him if he wasn't careful. Brandon's lips pressed into a firm line, and a deep furrow formed on his brow as he carefully stepped around the pale roots, his mind set on each movement. But the gnarled roots and slippery mud weren't the only things he had to watch out for. His grip tightened on the burlap sack slung over his shoulder, the rough fabric digging into his palm. His knuckles turned a shade darker than his already tanned skin as he clenched it tighter, his nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Still, his stride remained steady and sure. You couldn't show hesitation out here, not in this part of the swamp. A misstep could mean snagging on submerged wood that resembled coiled scales or catching the watchful glare of ancient, unseen eyes lurking beneath the water's surface. Brandon wasn't scared of the swamp itself or the creatures that lived there. What unsettled him was what lay at its heart. This was where the trees towered higher and the roots formed dense tangles, turning the murky waters into a labyrinth that could pull a man under, and a boy like him even faster. But it wasn't just the physical danger that made his skin crawl. The deeper you went, the more alive the swamp seemed, as though it breathed and watched and waited. His grandparents used to warn him, this was the domain of old, untamed spirits and forgotten gods. These grounds were sacred and unpredictable, and most folks with sense stayed far away. Normally, Brandon did too. The outskirts of the swamp had always been enough to satisfy his hunger for exploration, until 2 months ago. That's when Lulu vanished. Or at least that's what his father called it, a simple running away. But Brandon knew better. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he could hear her raspy, uneven breaths coming from somewhere deep in the swamp, blending with the croaks of frogs and the eerie yowls of bobcats. At first, it felt like she hadn't really gone at all. Lying in bed at night, with his back turned toward the wall and his eyes squeezed shut, he swore he could hear her fragile wheezing as though she was still curled up in her bed across the room, tethered to her green and silver oxygen tanks. Every time he rolled over to look, though, he saw only shadows. The bed was empty. Her breathing seemed to move, always just out of reach, behind the door, down the hallway, outside on the porch, at the edge of the dock, under the water, and farther still. Deeper and deeper, into the swamp. Brandon started hearing it even when the sun was blazing overhead, its heat burning against his freshly buzzed scalp. It was faint, almost like a whisper brushing past his ear, leaving him to wonder if he'd imagined it. But when everything around him went still, and he held his breath, there it was, the sound he couldn't mistake, the labored gasps of his sister fighting to breathe. Ghosts, spirits, and the walking dead didn't wander out in daylight, so it couldn't be anything else. It had to be Lulu. She was out there, leaving him a trail to follow. And so, Brandon followed. Day after day, he ventured farther into the swamp, deeper than he had ever dared, until he found himself at its heart. Until he found her. Now, every few days, he slogged through the muck and murk, carrying food and whatever company he could muster to bring to Lulu. Every step felt wrong, his entire being screaming at him to turn back, including a nagging voice in his head reminding him that this place wasn't meant for someone like him. The swamp's core wasn't somewhere a human boy should wander freely, it didn't belong to people. But here he was, trudging through the thick, sucking mud and the dark, stagnant water that climbed higher with each step. Brandon could tell he was getting close. The air was heavy with a metallic tang, the faint taste of copper settling on his tongue when he breathed in. The roots were thicker now, rising like pale, twisted veins out of the muddy water, which had reached his chest. It wouldn't be long now. Soon, he'd reach her again. Lifting the burlap sack high over his head, Brandon carefully maneuvered through the swamp, doing everything he could to keep it dry. Even with his best efforts, the coarse material was damp, darkened from the moisture seeping through. He couldn't let it touch the water, though, not with the meal inside. He didn't want to risk drawing any unwanted attention to himself or what he carried. Brandon held his breath as he approached a massive, ancient tree. Its thick trunk twisted upward, surrounded by the dense tangle of the swamp's wild growth. The sheer size of it made it impossible to see the branches until he was directly beneath it. Tilting his head all the way back, he squinted at the snarl of limbs above, searching for her. And then he saw her, Lulu, perched high above the murky water, sitting like a queen on a throne made of branches. She hadn't noticed him yet, and he dared not say a word. Something deep inside told him not to. He couldn't explain it, only that speaking here, in this place, felt wrong. So he stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on her as he waited for her to acknowledge him. That was always how it worked. Their meetings had been wordless since the day she disappeared, him waiting in silence until she finally turned her gaze his way. And every time, it struck him how beautiful she looked now. A beauty that belonged to the swamp, as if the wild had claimed her for itself. It wasn't something he had ever noticed before. Back at home, Lulu had always been confined to her bed, her frail body buried beneath layers of heavy blankets. Only her face peeked out, pale and damp with sweat, her eyes always shut tight. Her skin had looked like damp clay, lifeless and cold. Some nights, Brandon couldn't help but wonder if she was already dead, her shallow breathing just the sound of oxygen tanks wheezing their last gasps, and the rise and fall of her chest nothing more than rats shifting beneath the covers. But now, here in the swamp, Lulu looked alive. She perched high in the twisted branches of the biggest mangrove tree Tyler had ever laid eyes on. Its sprawling limbs seemed to claw at the sky, and there Lulu sat, her face tilted toward the sun, shadows of swaying leaves casting green patterns across her skin. Her hair was so different now, long, thick coils of ebony cascading over her chest and spilling down to where her abdomen should have been. Back when she was bedridden, their mom had always kept it cropped short. Now it was wild and untamed, just like the swamp. But her abdomen. Tyler tried not to let his gaze drift past it, but it always did. Every time his eyes slipped lower, a jolt of pure terror shot through him. It was an icy grip that twisted his insides, but just as quickly as it came, it would melt away, leaving only confusion in its wake. He didn't understand why it happened, or why the fear ebbed so fast. Even now, Tyler froze as that familiar fear clawed at him again. Past her waist, there was nothing. No hips, no legs, just emptiness. Her body ended abruptly, and from the torn edge, blackened intestines hung in rotting strands, writhing with fat, white maggots. They dangled down, blending eerily with the dark vines that snaked through her like veins. These same vines coiled out of the stumps where her arms used to be, replacing what had once been jagged, raw wounds with something unnatural. The clean cuts of her injuries made it obvious that this was no accident, someone had done this to her. The stench hit him hard, a suffocating wave of decay that filled his nose and mouth. It was thick, almost physical, forcing its way down his throat until he gagged. But just as before, the feeling passed, and he found himself breathing normally again. Tyler lingered for a moment longer, caught in his swirling emotions, when Lulu's head shifted abruptly. Her movements were strange, stiff and jerky, like a marionette pulled by strings. Her head lolled to the side for a moment, almost resting on her shoulder, before she struggled to lift it again. Tyler chalked it up to the years she'd spent confined to her bed. She'd never had the chance to grow strong like other people. Her body wasn't used to moving on its own, not after years of being tethered to oxygen tanks just to survive. Then her golden eyes found the sack in his hands. Her lips curled into a smile, tight and unnatural, scrunching her face and exposing teeth that had yellowed like old parchment. She stretched out her left arm toward him, fingers long and spindly, coated with a hardened layer of swamp mud up to the second knuckle. Her nails were sharp and thick, perfectly suited to her new life here. Tyler grinned back at her, proud of the meal he'd brought. With a quick motion, he drew his arm back and hurled the burlap sack upward. He'd been practicing, and this time, it only took one try. Lulu snatched the sack from the air with a snake-like swiftness, pulling it close to her chest as if guarding a treasure. Her hunger was obvious. She tore into the sack with wild urgency, ripping through its coarse fabric with fingers that moved almost too fast to follow. The contents nearly spilled from her grasp, but she caught them just in time, cupping her hands around them like she was cradling something precious. She raised it above her head, letting the dappled sunlight filter through the canopy and illuminate her prize. Tyler's chest swelled with pride as he watched her admire it, the bloodied, still beating heart of their father. It glistened wet and crimson against the swamp's greens and browns, but only for a moment. Lulu didn't waste time. With a feral growl, she sank her teeth into it, devouring it in savage bites. Her jaws worked furiously, shredding flesh and muscle with every chomp. The sounds were grotesque, wet squelches and deep snarls mixed with gasping breaths as she tore into the organ like a starving animal. Tyler didn't flinch. He wasn't horrified. If anything, he felt satisfied. A smile tugged at his lips as he watched her eat, pleased to see her hunger sated, proud of himself for helping her survive. But he knew better than to linger. The heart of the swamp wasn't a place for dawdling. Staying too long risked drawing the attention of something far worse than Lulu. And besides, there was still a mess waiting for him back home, a mess he'd have to clean up before anyone noticed their father was missing.